Salam, Sanvanani, Morweni, Namaste, Vanikam, Hetepu, and welcome to this episode of The People's Voice, produced and presented by your host, Shabnam Palesa Mohammed for Salaamedia. Salaamedia, of course, your humanitarian journalism portal and platform. We're broadcasting live from a chilly eThekwini, Durban, KZN, South Africa. Welcome to the show. What are we talking about tonight? Well, as if bullying is not a massive social problem already, with shocking videos surfacing online almost daily, cyberbullying is a growing problem in South Africa. Teenagers are especially under attack, with many becoming depressed and suicidal. We unpack cyberbullying, the law, and how to prevent child and teenage suicide with specialist attorney and coach Mollica Maharaj. And then in the second half of the show, a month ago, 2 children were almost kidnapped in broad daylight. Meanwhile, women are being rescued from gangs. Law enforcement seems to think human trafficking fears are exaggerated, so we tackle a critical question. Is South Africa in denial about human trafficking? Our guest, advocate Phumla Alpman from the Cornerstone Anti-Human Trafficking Institute. Let's help you tune into a robust and critical conversation tonight, so you can comment, ask our guest questions, and share your ideas. Here's how we get connected. You can watch via the Salaamedia Facebook page, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also listen live via Salaamedia's website, Salaamedia or TuneIn app, and of course, all free-to-air decoders. I'm going to start a watch party now, so that people who are on my networks are able to join what is a very important conversation. It's very easy. You go to the Salaamedia page, you look for the live video, which I've just found, and you go share as a watch party or start a watch party. And then everyone who's on your networks will be able to join us on this very important conversation. I'd like to welcome into studio first our first guest, attorney Mollica Maharaj.
Good evening, Shabnam. Good evening, listeners. Thank
Wonderful
you for having
to have
me
you on.
the show.
Mollica is an attorney, a specialist attorney in cyberbullying, and a coach for teenagers and for women's rights. It's wonderful to have you on the show, Mollica. Welcome to the People's Voice.
Thank you, Shabnam. It's lovely being on the show. Thank you very much.
All right, let's get straight into it. I see quite a few people have joined the conversation already, and that's good. These are critical topics for us to be talking about. Now, Mollica, according to a 2018 report by research company Ipsos Global Advisor, now it's 2018, of course, it's a bit dated, South Africa has a high prevalence of cyberbullying. Out of 28 countries surveyed, the report indicated that more than 80% of South Africans are aware of cyberbullying, and almost 75% of us believe that anti-bullying measures are inefficient. 54% of parents who took part said they know at least one child in their community who has been a victim of cyberbullying, and that was, of course, an increase of 24% since 2011. And those facts coming from Simon Dippenaar, also an attorney. So let's talk about this, Mollica. Let's start here. How is cyberbullying defined in South Africa compared to internationally? And then, as a follow-on, how do you think it should be better defined to be more effective in stopping cyberbullying?
So, absolutely correct, Shabnam. The stats are alarming. South Africa is in the top 5 countries where cyberbullying is rife. 1 in 5 South African teens have experienced cyberbullying firsthand. So this is really alarming. It is a very serious issue. The term cyberbullying immediately makes us think of the traditional bully as we knew it at school and the subordinate victim. However, this term has now coined a new status, a new definition. Cyberbullying now takes place over social media. So like devices like your cell phones, computers, tablets. Cyberbullying also occurs through SMSs, text, apps, or online in social media forums, and also gaming platforms. So cyberbullying includes sending, posting, or sharing negative, harmful, false, mean content about someone. It can include sharing personal information or private information about someone else, causing them real embarrassment or humiliation. Some cyberbullying also crosses the line into unlawful and criminal behavior. as the Cyberbullying Research Center defines it as well, basically the cyberbullying acts willfully and it's repeated behavior. This definition I find is standard across on international platforms as well as in South Africa. Coming to the question, can it be better defined in a more effective way to stop the bullying? Absolutely. Whilst I think the definition is pretty self-explanatory and comprehensive currently, yes, it can be better defined, I think, to encompass that it is a civil and criminal offense. Due to the high stats, I think this definition can be written, in a much more firmer manner, where it acts as a deterrent in the sense where people actually stop and take accountability for their behavior.
Absolutely important. I see we've got quite a few people joining us for this conversation today. Welcome Rowan Sucharan, Avi Mohammed, Deni Teva, Dagi Oaks, Juanita Balkisun Chitepo, Pregi Governor, Yegin Pariachi, Isitronics, Deshni Governor, and of course also watching on the Salaamedia live video as well. Great to have you on board, everyone. Now, Mollica, New Zealand has specific laws against online abuse. What impact do our current civil and criminal laws have against cyberbullying? So let's talk about the current legislation first. And then I want to know, what impact will the new cyber harassment laws have?
Okay, so cyberbullying is a new development in the legal sense in South Africa, and we don't have specific legislation talking to cyberbullying and the consequences. However, this does not mean there are no consequences for cyberbullying. Victims of cyberbullying can rely on remedies that are currently offered by our criminal and civil justice system. So depending on the nature of the acts committed by the perpetrator, he or she can be criminally charged with the following, and I'm going to give you three under the Criminal Procedure Act. So criminal injuria, and simply put for our viewers, this refers to where the dignity of the victim is injured. For example, if a child is being teased or humiliated by use of improper or racially offensive language. The second one, sexual exploitation and grooming. So this refers where you're trying to obtain inappropriate images from another individual, and generally along the pornographic sort of lines. And then criminal defamation. So this refers to the intentional and unlawful publication of a matter concerning another person which damages his or her reputation. For example, posting lies or fallacies about a person on social media so everyone actually sees it and causes damage to their reputation. There's also the civil aspect of the law and remedies, where the victim can obviously rely on a protection order which can be obtained against a cyberbully at a magistrate's court. I think in an instance like this, it's very important for viewers to note that you need to screenshot, screen match messages, those postings, because they are an integral part of the case and evidence. Also, I just want to touch on very quickly for our viewers, because as we know, and you've mentioned, this is something that's absolutely rife with teenagers and children right now. If the cyberbully is a child, there are different criminal procedures that will follow under the Criminal Child Justice Act. So, for example, if somebody is 17 years old, he or she does not have criminal capacity and cannot be found guilty of a criminal offense. However, this does not mean there are no consequences for children. I think parents should take note of this. Children are and can be held accountable. If the incident is reported to the school or to the governing body of the school, disciplinary can be held and a child can be suspended. So I think, it is serious and viewers need to take note of this. In terms of encompassing and new laws coming, I think, really we need to come together from a government perspective, from the legal professionals, together, and a proper policy and frameworks need to be created. So I think specifically talking to cyberbullying, we are still in very early stages, and it's a long walk to create proper legislation crafted around cyberbullying per se, and specific to cyberbullying.
Well, absolutely, I would say that we've got to have, in as much as there are existing common law, criminal law, civil law measures and legislation, certainly we need proper cyber harassment laws in our country. And I suppose that's also where activists and civil society step in and say to government, well, what's happening? In your view, Mollica, why is there a delay to legislate proper laws dealing with cyberbullying, cyber harassment, and cyber abuse?
I don't think it's a delay. I think, as I said, there are laws that we can rely on in terms of cyberbullying. For me, I think, we're very slow to respond as a society and as a community is because of this, I think, the lack of awareness. I often hear of incidences that have happened with children, but it's almost swept under the carpet. So we don't really raise our voice against this. And I think as a society, as communities, we need to raise our voice, just like how we do for women abuse, gender-based violence. We need to take a very strong stand for cyberbullying. Until we don't do this, it's going to be, it's just one of those things, and it's okay. So I think also, having said that, you can look, recently we've had, it's really applaudable, we've had a case where Facebook users can now be sued for damages as a result for defamatory remarks made on Facebook. And again, this is something that equates to cyberbullying at the end of the day as well. So I think we need to have a much stronger voice. We need to stand against this, and we need to stand up for our children, for the adults that are not strong enough to have a voice to protect themselves. And I think it'll automatically get the attention it needs, and the specific laws will automatically follow from there.
Absolutely agree. I mean, we're constantly hearing of children who are depressed, suicidal, commit suicide because of bullying. And cyberbullying is a platform for bullying to take place, often anonymously, which leaves children and adults susceptible to extreme amounts of trauma. Mollica, children and teens are more online now during lockdown than ever before, right? Because many of them, those that are privileged enough to have access to the internet and to devices, are learning online. Beyond the legislation, what can be done on a governmental, educational, and societal level to eradicate forms of bullying and cyberbullying? What can we do? What should we be doing?
So I think a good start is the government has created a South African National Cybersecurity Awareness Portal, which creates awareness and offers a help guide to individuals out there. It provides links and guides on protection methods to protect children, teens, and adults too. Then we also have schools and society, as I said, that play a role in creating awareness and sharing the laws and what help is available. And this should continue as far as possible. To eradicate cyberbullying, I think we as a society need to take a stand against it, as I said. We need to be constant in raising the awareness, calling out cyberbullies, and we need to take a stand to fight for the victims. Victims generally feel that it's their fault. They feel disempowered. They're already in a low space with self-esteem, anxiety, depression. So we need to take a stand and fight for these individuals. And I think once we start doing this, and we stand as a community, as a society, and people feel secure and safe that there is help, it will start eradicating this type of behavior.
And I think at some level, it's also important for us to understand the perpetrators of bullying as to what exactly motivates a person to want to inflict this type of harm on somebody else. Like when it comes to gender-based violence, it's as important for us to understand and treat and rehabilitate the perpetrators. Otherwise, it becomes a repeat cycle, as it is for us to understand and treat and support the victims. Malika, where are children and teens learning bullying and cyberbullying from? Where are they learning it?
I personally think, and from what I've observed and my experience has shown me, this is a behavior learned from reckless usage of technology. I find the abuser has a false sense of security because they hide behind a screen. As I said earlier, the traditional bully is somebody that in the schoolyard or around the corner when you're going home from school. Now the bully is behind a screen, it's behind technology, so you don't know who the bully is. The bully comes from children or teens with their own psychological struggles. They have personal challenges at home, or also may have been victims of some sort of troubling incident in their own lives. So I quickly want to share with you as well, the types of people who are cyberbullies. So that can perhaps, help the viewers or the listeners actually identify them. So in terms of cyberbullies, you have like a few types. For example, the power hungry. So these are the type of people that guard and seek attention. They love controlling other people. They want to intimidate their victims because they purely just want a reaction and they know they're going to get a reaction. They control by fear. You have something called the retaliating victim. And this person was traditionally probably bullied themselves in the past, and now they seek revenge on other bullies. So they also are not very computer savvy or very smart and will probably end up exposing themselves online with a true identity. Then you have what I think we all know is the mean girl concept. And these are people that just bully for entertainment. They just bored of their lives and they want to increase their popularity by putting others down. And they often do it in groups and they like to intimidate both online and offline.
Right.
Then we also
All right.
have
I don't think Mean Girls is limited to girls, but it refers to
No,
that movie,
absolutely
right?
not. Absolutely not. So the term is
Yeah.
coined mean girls, but it includes all genders.
Yes.
So it's just a term, obviously, on Stop Cyberbullying as a term coined, but yes, absolutely noteful to point out, it includes all genders, not just girls.
I think that what you were talking about earlier in terms of where they learn it from, I believe a lot of it is rooted not only in popular culture, which seems to glamorize bullying and a show of power, but also what's happening in the home. If you're observing bullying and gender-based violence in your own home, inevitably children learn that this is normal. This is cool even, and this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Would you agree?
Absolutely. So it becomes their method of how to respond. Because remember, as you're rightfully saying, this is normal to them. It's the environment in which they're used to responding. They watch the behavior, and ultimately you mirror the behaviors that you are watching. So it becomes your mode of response to the external environment. Because now it's not only internal, it becomes my mechanism to respond externally as well.
And it's ingrained in them because they've been socialized, right? If you've grown up in this environment or you're in a school environment where bullying is not taken seriously. So if you go and complain to someone in charge and say, look, I'm being bullied, and then the person in authority says, it's just how it is at school, just deal with it. We've all experienced it growing up. It's not that serious until they see blood. So if it's a violent attack, then okay, maybe we'll do something about it. But the psychological trauma is not taken seriously enough by schools, and perhaps it needs to be incorporated into the curriculum. What is bullying and how to deal with conflict in a mature, in a healthy way that doesn't resort to bullying. So, Malika, you work with teenagers as a coach. How can teenagers unlearn this healthy, this toxic, and potentially dangerous behavior?
So I think definitely through education. I think education starts at home with the parents. And I think as soon as you give your child an electronic device, you need to teach them how to be cyber safe. And I think we need to coin that term today. And we all need to know that term because it applies not only to the children, but to adults out there as well. So if you're going onto social media platforms, we are extremely vulnerable as individuals. Children are even more vulnerable with what's going on. And I think very nicely leading into the second part of your segment today, human trafficking, because as we know, social media has become a hotspot to pick up and find victims, find your targets. So this is something that can be unlearned definitely. Bullying is not cool. It's not popular. People don't like bullies. So education needs to start at home with the parents when you give your child that device. The responsibility starts at home. Then it moves to educators as well, to schools, because let's face it, technology is encouraged today to be used at schools. And hence, education follows from there. Also, I think schools need to take a much harsher, stronger approach to cyberbullying and how children are dealt with, because until you don't make an example or show people how severe this is, people are not going to take it seriously. So it all starts with education, creating that awareness, and hashtagging no cyberbullying. It should just stop. So for me, definitely it starts with the education, Shabnam, no doubt, and it starts at home.
Absolutely agree. So, in the home environment, in the school environment, in our communities, we need to take a stand against cyberbullying. We need to help bullies unlearn this bullying behavior, and we need to teach people who are victims to be able to stand up for themselves. We've got some comments. Deepa Maharaj says, well said. So true. Let's equip our children. Jyoti Maharaj says, we as adults need to provide a safe environment for children to feel safe. Jyoti also says we need to equip our kids with ways of protecting themselves and create a safe environment for them to ask for help. So important. Fiona Hussein says, I think we need ways of teaching our kids to strengthen themselves as well as equipping themselves with ways of combating cyberbullying. All very valuable comments from our Salaamedia guests, of course, because children who don't unlearn bullying grow up to become adults who bully. And then we see that in
Absolutely.
relationships, it manifests in the work environment, it manifests in community spaces, everywhere really. And then it becomes a problem that affects the entireness of society. Malika, what are the signs, firstly, and secondly, the effects of cyberbullying on children and on teenagers? What have you observed?
So I think you need to monitor your children or your friends, because cyberbullying is not only for children or teenagers, also adults. So you'll find they spend far less time on their computers or cell phones. Their reaction when they get an email or a WhatsApp message or a text message, they're uneasy about going to school or don't want to go to school. Also, they will appear angry, frustrated, depressed. Just lash out when you ask simple questions because they think there's probably more to it. And I think they also avoid discussions, I found, about what they're doing on the computer, what's going on their cell phone, or generally what's going on in their lives. But the biggest telltale sign is personality change. You know your friend, you know your children. You will notice they will become withdrawn. There'll be loss of friends, keeping to themselves. You'll see the stress. So these are the signs. Um, the effect of this is actually eventually the child ends up feeling lonely, isolated. There's low self-esteem, and this is when the suicidal, that anxiety, that there's I don't have anyone to speak to. So it's very important that we identify these and constantly chat and communicate to our children and our teens and adults that there's help if something is not right, if something is bothering you, if someone is bullying you, there is help, and there are consequences to it.
Mhm. And of course, it takes a village to raise a child. So it may not be your biological child, but if you're in contact with a child where you can see this child is exhibiting symptoms of some sort of stress, of trauma that's possibly linked to bullying and cyberbullying, it's important to give that child advice, to understand what's going on, to connect them with assistance via their families, via their educational spaces, via organizations like Childline, for example, that can actually assist them, because the effects are devastating, and we do not want to have another child feeling suicidal because they don't know how to deal with this bullying that's going on. It's one of the greatest tragedies in society, is a child who feels completely alone. And yes, cyberbullying is a form of abuse. It is exactly like how you get physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, psychological abuse. Cyberbullying falls there within that realm of verbal and psychological abuse. And of course, this trend that exists in society of what is called roasting. So it's become a cool thing to insult people for the amusement of others that find pleasure in that sort of sadistic behavior. So a child may feel, it's just roasting. It's what we do in our class. It's fine. They may brush it off. But on a deeper psychological level, they're feeling that impact and that damage to their self-esteem. How can they be empowered, Mollica, against this cruelty that affects them so seriously?
So first and foremost, I want to tell all our listeners, and whoever watches this going forward, I want you to remember one thing: it is not your fault. It never is. You are not alone. Help is always available. Talk about these issues. You have trusted adults, you have parents, you have teachers We have healthcare professionals. As you also said, there's Childline, Lifeline. We've got SAPS. We've got Gender-Based Violence Command Center. We've got the Human Rights Commission. And then lastly, you do have legal channels that I've mentioned. So, you know, there are options out there. So don't feel alone and don't feel that my only option is taking my life, because it's not. You are worth far more than that. You are worth far more than a cyberbully.
Absolutely. And I hope that people watching and listening to the show are going to share it with children, teenagers, and adults out there who may be so close to committing suicide and we may not realize it. I want to take a comment and then a question before my last question for you, Mollica. Tariq Sumar says, parents should put an age limit on children having a tablet or a laptop and educate them about why. Some kids don't want to use educational apps. They want WhatsApp and Facebook. Do you agree with that approach? Should it be an age limit where now children are required to have access to these electronic devices for the purposes of education? So can we put an age limit on it? Or is it more about the education? Inevitably, they're going to end up on WhatsApp and Facebook. So should we be restricting them from that, or should we be teaching them about responsible use of such applications?
So I think, and this is also my personal view, because obviously I think giving your child a device is very topical, and you find lots of parents, for various reasons, encourage giving their child devices. So for me, I think there should be an age limit. You know, it's almost like you need to be an adult to be able to do certain things in your life. You need to be age 21, age 18. There's an age limit to get when you can start driving, going for your learners as well. So there are age limits in place for certain things in life already. As a society, as a community, it's not something that's new to us. Giving an 8-year-old a device and opening them up to all these apps without being cyber safe and having the responsibility, I think then as adults and as a parent, there's some sort of negligence. I personally will not do it, because I think there's a great sense of responsibility that comes with using these platforms. You need to know how to also lock your devices. So don't have your social media on public settings, for example. It's important to keep it on private settings, because you never know who's trolling or who's going to troll or who's going to pick you as a victim for bullying you. So it's very important. Also, with technology, it's not like 20 years ago where everything was protected. Information is being shared openly on the internet. So you need to make sure that you have the relevant viruses, antiviruses, so your kids are locked down from inappropriate information, inappropriate images. So definitely, I think there should be an age limit with what's out there today on the internet, what's out there with technology. So I definitely think when we're implementing these policy frameworks, age limit is something we need to look at, definitely.
Absolutely. All right, we've got about a minute or so to go and a couple of comments. Fiona Hussein says, we as parents need to be approachable to the children so they feel comfortable enough to open up. Such an important point there, Fiona. And Deepa Maharaj says, how do we make an example of cyberbullying? What legal recourse is there? Can you comment on in either of those comments, Mollica, or both of them? So the first one is about being approachable, and the second one is what legal recourse is there to set an example?
So I definitely think having open communications with your children, with your teens, you know, just being a teenager, I have a teenager, I think it's just such a difficult or a strange time in their lives, because they're finding themselves between being a child and, you know, getting into early adulthood. So having those open, transparent conversations, giving them a safe haven in your home to come to where they feel safe to share. And I think with the laws we have touched on it. So I think definitely as parents, go and get that protection order if you need to. Go and open that criminal case if you need to. And yes, make an example and share it. So people use it as a deterrent to know that this will not be tolerated by us as society and as a community.
All right, Mollica Maharaj, attorney specializing in many areas, including cyberbullying, also a coach for teenagers and women's rights. Mollica, if I may ask, How can people get hold of you? People who are watching the show right now and have a matter of cyberbullying. Of course, I might approach it very differently as a mediation practitioner, but if they're looking for litigation, how would they get hold of you?
So I am the managing director at Raymond & Raymond Incorporated, corporate commercial law firm here in Sandton. I am on Facebook, so you can get me on the Raymond & Raymond Incorporated page. You can DM me, Mollica Maharaj, on Facebook and on Instagram. And if they need further details, I'm happy for you to share my cell phone number, Shabnam, after the show, whoever may need any assistance.
Absolutely fantastic. Mollica Maharaj, attorney specializing in cyberbullying as well as a coach for teenagers and women's rights. Thank you very much for joining us on The People's Voice and for being a voice for the people.
Thank you, Shabnam. It was lovely being on the show. I really enjoyed it, and I hope the listeners enjoyed it. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening. All right. So in the first half of our show, we've been in conversation with Mollica Maharaj, attorney and coach for teenagers, as well as women's rights. Very interesting conversation there. I'm hoping you're going to share the link to today's show so more people can benefit from it. In the second half of the show, we're in conversation with advocate Phumla Alpman-Dwane, and we're going to be talking about human trafficking, very important topic for us to be discussing today. So let's welcome her onto the show. And I believe we're going to be doing a telephonic interview because of internet connectivity issues. Advocate Phumla Alpman, welcome to the People's Voice.
Thank you very much for inviting me today.
It's such a pleasure to have you on. Of course, you are the co-founder of Cornerstone Anti-Human Trafficking Institute. Very important conversation for us to be having in our country. Very controversial one. We see heated debates online regarding this particular subject. But maybe a little bit of an introduction. In 2019, police in Mpumalanga investigated a case of suspected human trafficking after they found 104 held captives during raids in one weekend. They received a tip from a woman who informed them that she too was being kept against her will at a house in the area and was drugged and raped. It's unclear how she escaped. Police have arrested 60 people on charges of human trafficking, drug possession, and prostitution. Experts say that human trafficking, which is the second largest global industry, is a 2 trillion rand industry where people are forced into prostitution or other forms of exploited labor. Advocate Dwane Alpman, you are an expert in this area, so it's such an honor to have you on the show today. Let's start here. How is human trafficking defined in South Africa compared to internationally? And then as a follow-on question, how should it be better defined to be more effective in stopping human trafficking?
Thank you for asking that question. Well, you see, our definition of human trafficking has its origins from the international definition, which is the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, supplementing the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime of 2000. Basically, when we're talking about human trafficking, we are talking about three elements. The act, so it is where a person is recruited, transported, transferred, harbored, or received by, and the methods used obviously vary from the threat or use of force to deception, abuse of power, or a position of vulnerability in order to achieve the consent of that person having control over another person. And the whole purpose of the act and the method is for the purpose of exploitation. And what the UN protocol defines at the minimum is the exploitation of the prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor, etc. So what in effect our legislation, which is the Prevention and Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act of 2013, is really to expand on the actions, the methods used, and the purposes of exploitation. So our definition is more broader than the international definition of human trafficking. We also have, there's a distinction between child trafficking and adult trafficking, which is also contained in the international definition, which is also contained in our South African definition. The other beauty about our legislation is that it also makes provision for 3 types of trafficking in persons offenses. So we are not confined to the trafficking in persons offense in Article 3A of the protocol. We have the additional ones are the adoption of a child for the purposes of exploitation, and also it caters for the distorted versions of ukutwala and forced marriage for the purposes of exploitation. So that is our definition of human trafficking. I would not say, I would like to argue that South Africa has one of the best legislations globally. And the problem is not the definition, but the understanding of the elements of trafficking in persons. And also, you also have to get more interpretation into some of the concepts that haven't been interpreted through your legislative guides of the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. So you have words like harboring, where you actually have to use the grammatical meaning of that word, which are not necessarily defined in the Act. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does indeed. It's a brilliant start to this conversation, Advocate Phumla Alpman, which leads me to the second question. In your experience, what impact do our current civil and criminal laws have against human trafficking? And where are the glaring omissions in the law where, if you were the legislator, you would change it?
All right. Thank you very much. I think that the law that we have in place does act as a deterrent, because it is so wide. It applies not just to natural persons, it also applies to fictitious deed persons. So your partnerships and companies who might be involved in human trafficking would not be immune from investigation and prosecution, because you just need to look at the definition of persons in Section 1 of the legislation. And it tells you that it includes a natural person, a juristic person, and a partnership. The second aspect, which I think is beautiful about our legislation, is that the courts have extraterritorial jurisdiction. So any of the offenses which are of human trafficking or associated offenses, like using the services of a victim of trafficking, which are committed outside the borders of South Africa, a person can be charged if they fulfill certain requirements. For example, I'm not going to mention all of them. That person is a South African citizen or a resident, or that person was found on South African territory or waters or in a ship or vessel or an aircraft, or a person has not been application for extradition has not happened of that specific person, or the person is a juristic person or partnership registered in South Africa. The other aspect is that there are also harsh penalties in terms of Section 13, which range from a fine of 100 million or imprisonment, which could include life imprisonment without an option of a fine, up to up to 5 years imprisonment or a fine. The one thing that is glaring, I think, and South Africa has been criticized for it, is the option of a fine, which has been found to be problematic. If you go through some of the reports of the U.S. State Department on trafficking in persons, South Africa has been criticized for this aspect, especially with respect to trafficking in persons in terms of Section 4, subsection 1. And if you look at the 2020 U.S. State Department report, you will see that it acknowledges that the penalties accorded by South African legislation on trafficking in persons are stringent, but has stated the following, that, with regard to sex trafficking, by allowing for a fine as opposed to imprisonment, the punishment is not commensurate with those for other serious crimes such as rape. So I think Absolutely. That is where one would need to look at possibly amending the legislation. And also you get, in some court cases where, presiding officers are actually imposing fines as opposed to heavy imprisonment sentences. It's not in all cases, but in some cases we've had such.
Well, it's certainly an issue that needs to be investigated, Advocate. We've got a comment here from Vashti Downs, who works with sex workers, and she says, we say we have great legislature, but on the ground level, women are being trafficked daily and very little is being done about it. So here's someone on the ground like you who's working with women and who says, the laws are great, but very little is being done about it to eradicate human trafficking. Let's talk about statistics, Advocate, related to South Africa. And of course, the very famous saying about lies and statistics. Stats are only, of course, reported matters, and of course, those that are researched, and that's how stats come up. And here's some of these stats. 1.2 million children are trafficked annually. Half of them are African. It is estimated that 30,000 children are being raped, prostituted in South Africa. Half of these children are younger than 14 years old. Children as young as 4 are raped, prostituted. There are up to 10,000 child rape prostitutes in Johannesburg. Up to 1,000 girls are trafficked to South Africa from Mozambique every year. The Eastern Cape, Mpumalanga, and Limpopo are the main recruitment areas for victims of human trafficking. And those stats from Hope South Africa, the schools curriculum. In your experience, Advocate, can you share with us what are the more recent statistics on human trafficking? And just to move also away from talking only about statistics, can you share with us some real life experiences that you or your organizations have been involved with most recently?
All right, thank you very much. I think, in terms of statistics, that's a very difficult and dicey one because they're accurate statistics. And, because of the nature of the offense itself, it's very clandestine. And I think what we are lacking in is, the data collection. So the one thing, the most recent statistics that have been released, especially relating to South Africa, for example, are contained in the U.S. State Department report of 2020, which really was an approach whereby, various stakeholders were asked to provide information to contribute towards that report. And the one thing that I can share with you, according to that report, especially in South Africa, is that there has been an increase in the figures of trafficking in persons victims. There also has been a large representation of men and young girls. And at the moment, men comprise the majority of the victims. Statistics also show that South Africa is a destination country with foreign victims being in the majority. We are now having a changed scenario where, trafficking in persons for forced labor has become dominant, as opposed to trafficking in persons for sexual exploitation. And also, prosecutions have declined slightly from the previous year. Now, according to this document, with a concerted effort of government and non-governmental organizations, the number of identified victims was 377. And compared to 2018, which was 260. There were 238 men, 79 were women, 26 were boys, and 34 were girls. And in that amount, in that figure, there were 312 victims who were foreign nationals, and 65 were South Africans. So traffickers exploited about 300 victims in forced labor and 112 in sex trafficking. So those are just the round of figures. Also, your investigations show you a picture of the cases that are reported. And, the number of cases that have been investigated by the Hawks, for example, the Directorate of Priority Crime Investigations, altogether in total were 19 potential trafficking in persons cases, of which 13 were potential sex trafficking cases and 6 were potential labor trafficking cases. And there have also been joint operations between the Department of Labor and the South African Police Services, where, victims of human trafficking for forced labor were rescued, which contained 91 Malawian nationals, 37 of whom were children who were discovered. And about 7 Chinese nationals were arrested, which included 4 men and women. In terms of prosecution, the government has prosecuted about 71 alleged trafficking perpetrators compared to the previous reporting period, which was 77. And of those prosecuted, 44 were men and 27 were women. So you kind of get a picture of what of what human trafficking looks like. The government has been criticized for not comprehensively monitoring or investigating forced child labor or the labor trafficking of adults in the agricultural, mining, construction, and fishing sectors. So that is what the picture looks like. It is not a holistic picture. It is a picture that is informed by cases which have been reported. So we could be talking about a larger number.
Certainly very interesting. And you're right, it does paint a picture. I want to take some comments before my next 3 questions for you. Vashti Downs agrees these that have been reported, most of the time case dockets are not even opened. Daily, women in our city are being trafficked between brothels. I myself have taken women to police stations and have been turned away due to the police not believing the women. So here's a real life experience here of how the police are failing victims of human trafficking. And she goes on to say, since COVID, we've seen an influx of young women who've been trafficked in from the rural communities and townships to make money in the city. Many have been promised jobs at the casino and have then been taken to brothels and exploited. So certainly very scary reality that we're facing, where women are absolutely being exploited because of poverty, but also when they try to report it to police stations, they've been turned away because police don't actually believe them. So, Advocate, do you have any comment on those that feedback from Vashti?
Yes, I think the problem lies with education and awareness raising. That's the first thing. Because I have found in my experience, because I started dealing with trafficking in 2015 after I'd completed my master's. And I went around, especially the rural police stations, and I found that there was a lack of understanding from some of the police officials. There's another situation that we could explain. For example, I think in the previous report that was done by the U.S. State Department, they had reported that there were a couple of cases, for example, in Pretoria, where, women would go there and say that we had been trafficked. And then the next thing, the officials would pick up the phone and phone the perpetrators and say, come and pick up the victims in one of the police stations. I think it was Sunnyside Police Station. So you are also getting a situation where there is collusion between the perpetrators and the law enforcement officials. In the COVID-19 crisis, there have been cases of women who've been lured and promised, given false promises on job opportunities. I had a situation like that in May this year when I was working for another organization, where I received a call that there were 2 young women. I think the youngest was about 24, who had been stranded in Cape Town because they had met up with somebody on Facebook who had invited them as a friend and then promised them jobs as domestic workers. They got onto the taxi, came to Cape Town, and tried to phone this woman, and she did not pick up the phone. I don't know whether she either managed to get somebody else. So they got stranded and they had to be turned back. So they had to return to Mpumalanga, but unfortunately, because of the restrictions, they were then returned to Cape Town. So they were stuck in one of the informal settlements, and they had to be extracted from there and be placed in a place of safety. The problem was because the act had happened, the recruitment, and that they were transported. does not necessarily mean that's not human trafficking, but because people were of the opinion that the three elements were not present, they felt that that was not human trafficking, but potential human trafficking. But in any event, my problem is that, we don't, as a nation, make provision for such cases. And as a result, those two women had to find their own way back to Mpumalanga, where, the families were informed about their plight and had to raise funds in order to transport them back to Mpumalanga.
Absolutely shocking there, advocate. And we're supposed to be living in this culture of human rights. I've got 3 more questions for you and 9 minutes to go. Couple of comments. Tesna Aston talks about, we live in a society that peddles our children from the day that they are born. Nawawi Matthew says South Africa is a safe haven for human traffickers. Vashti agrees that there's massive collusion, and she says, I think Phumla and I need to be friends. I would absolutely agree for the both of you to connect. My next question. Trafficking in South Africa is on the rise. At a press conference in 2018, Lieutenant Colonel Parmanand Jagwa, the Hawks Gauteng coordinator of the Illegal Migration Desk, and Deputy Director Rasaki Bika said that human trafficking was a growing activity in the region. In response to the rising numbers, the U.S. Department of State released a report criticizing our government's methodology, noting that the government had made little progress in the prosecution of traffickers connected to international syndicates, which facilitated sex and labor trafficking with impunity throughout the country, and that the government did little to address reports of official complicity in trafficking crimes and efforts by officials. Yet, advocate, others in law enforcement don't seem to be treating human trafficking as seriously as they should. So here's the question, why? Why have we not stopped human trafficking? Why are we in denial? And very importantly, who benefits from this denials on the issue of human trafficking?
I think that's a very good question, but the question is, who are we addressing this question to? Because the denial on human trafficking, firstly, would be a contradiction in terms of the recent report by the U.S. State Department on trafficking in persons, which is relied on information furnished by us, South Africans, the respective countries as well, which includes government and civil society. Now, when it comes to public perception, I would tend to disagree that there's denial. Society sees human trafficking as real, and it's happening. There've been social media conversations, constant, discussion about human trafficking. People are sharing stories and experiences. Although they might not necessarily know the general elements of human trafficking, people have a general idea of what human trafficking is. And there's also a situation where we are having the underreporting happening. But the underreporting, there are various factors which contribute to underreporting, namely, are members of the public confident to report such cases to the police in terms of their understanding of human trafficking? There's another situation. How safe are the people who actually report these cases? Do they get the necessary witness protection? Are they informed about these rights? That's the second aspect. The third one is the collusion aspect that we keep on talking about, which is problematic. So there are various factors which actually contribute to this underreport. Secondly, civil society, that's your NGOs and your CBOs who are working in the space, know that this is happening and it's real. There are some organizations that have done research and they tell you that it exists. But then you do have other organizations who say, child trafficking is a myth. Some deny that, there's a massive systematic problem with human trafficking. And they are probably in denial for a variety of reasons. But I disagree with this point of view. In government, you have dedicated people who are involved in task teams, who are involved in various departments be it the National Prosecuting Authority, be it the SAPS, the Hawks, be it, the Labor Department, etc., who are very committed towards the eradication of human trafficking. And they actually are facing it. But I think my criticism is the government figures at high level who don't recognize this as a problem. And I would like to argue is that they probably don't want to deal with it. I think once you realize that there's a problem, you have to deal with it. And you also you will require resources and investment and labor. Now, when I conducted a workshop in 2017 in Port Elizabeth on the legal provisions of human trafficking, one policeman, high-ranking police official said to me, one of the problems that we're having in government is that there's no political will. So as to why there's no political will, I cannot explain, but there seems to be that view. And of course, corruption is another element which needs to be brought into the fore. We are not saying that there hasn't been any criminal action against some people who have colluded with the perpetrators, but there are still allegations of complicity amongst officials. The taking of bribes, so that people are not deported or people are not charged, or that, that's what's been happening with respect to these cases.
Advocate, we've got about 3 minutes to go. I've got 2 questions for you and a number of comments coming through. Vashti Down says, I don't think the public are confident to report it all, and I don't think they're safe, especially due to collusion with the police. Even the ladies that we work with are too scared to tell the truth. They don't see the point of reporting their trafficking experiences because they are not believed. And too often the traffickers have connections with powerful people. Thesna Aston has a view that we need to tighten border controls, given that foreigners, especially children, are being trafficked into South Africa for work. And she says that the public only sees or understands trafficking to be sexual and not forced employment. She also says, thank you so much, Advocate Phumla and Shabnam. I understand a lot better. My last 2 questions for you, and we've got 2 to 3 minutes, Advocate, unfortunately. Your master's thesis on mandatory reporting, the legal protection of child victims of trafficking for the exploitation of child labor in South Africa. Take us through this argument in your master's thesis, if you can summarize very quickly, and associated offenses, very important.
All right, thank you very much. My thesis was at the time when the legislation was not yet operational. And I think one of the challenges that I saw facing the prevention of trafficking was the underreporting of this crime. And for me, the area of concern was the layperson who has set a very high standard to report child trafficking. And my argument is that the standard used is high, because when you look at organizations that work within the space, like your designated child protection organization, they have a lower standard of suspicion. So they have to be suspicious in order for them to report human trafficking. And I saw that this would actually place a burden on mandatory reporting, because in terms of child trafficking, any person is required to report human trafficking. And obviously, in order for people to have that knowledge, they have to be educated and made aware about the elements of human trafficking. So for me, the concern was, how will a lay person identify a child victim of trafficking for the exploitation of labor in the domestic service? The reason for that was, it's so clandestine, and I just looked for that case scenario. And then whether the legislation is clear on who the mandatory reporters are and what is required of them, and what are the legal implications of non-reporting for the mandatory reporter. And are these all in the best interest of the child, especially your warrantless searches and entries into premises where human trafficking is suspected? So it was in light of that as to whether the legislation needed some kind of improvement and so forth. And I can safely say is that the definition of child trafficking or of human
Advocate
trafficking.
Alpman, I'm going to have to pause you there. I think we're going to definitely need a follow-up conversation. We're going to have to start rounding up now. I do hope that at some point you're appointed as the head of our anti-human trafficking department. I'm going to close off with a comment from Vashti Down. She says, one of my ladies has been trafficked 3 times since she was 13. She's now 25 and recently gave birth to a baby who was conceived when she was trafficked last year. She went to the police and they told her that she asked for it because she was a sex worker. And
Yeah.
that's where we're going to leave the conversation this evening. We'll have to invite Advocate Alpman back to another show. I want to say thank you very much to you, Advocate, for being with us on The People's Voice and for being a voice of the people.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
An absolute pleasure. I want to say thank you to both our guests, Attorney Mollica Maharaj and Advocate Phumla Alpman-Dwane, our listeners and our viewers for engaging on these very important topics, and of course the Salaamedia team. Remember to ask ourselves every day, what am I doing to make my community, my country, and my world a better place? Until the next show, revolutionary peace. Assalamu alaikum.